Hello, we are going to continue on with our sewn books, but we have already done the the 6 running stitch with a hard cover, flat back journal. We did that. Here's another version of this, sewing onto tapes, which are sort of like ribbons that are used to give more stability to the book block. This one has the binding on the outside, so we've got lots of different versions here for you to try out on your own. We are also going to do something that kind of reminds me of what we learned in our stab bindings, that there can be fancy sewing patterns that you employ to make your book a little bit more interesting, more aesthetically interesting than actually structurally interesting, but you know, nothing wrong with that. All right, so we're going to be doing essentially this binding today. It looks like, here's one version, here's another. Our book is going to look something like this, right? And so it's going to be a running stitch with this bead here, also called a pearl. I like to call it a bead, on the outside of the book. So we're going to do a fabric binding, book cloth binding, or excuse me, covering. And essentially we have one signature here that we're going to be sewing onto the actual structure of the book. So let's take stock of what we have here today. You should have a little strip of paper that we're going to be using for our jig. You should also have a couple pieces of stiff paper that you're going to use for your end papers. The inside of this is going to look something like this. So that's what this is. And incidentally, just to remind you about some of the conventions for our measuring. So this paper here is 5.5 inches high. So I added 1/4 of an inch to the actual Davy board so that there would be this little overhang here to protect the book block. When I figured out what my end paper should be, since I'm just gluing that down flat, I decided that it needed to be the same size as the paper, or essentially 1/4 of an inch less than my height of the book cover. So in other words, this is 5.5, this is 5 3/4, and this is 5.5. All right, and that gives it a nice tidy sort of border around the book cloth that we see folded over the edge of the Davy board. All right, so that's that. We have a couple pieces of Davy board ready to go. As I mentioned, this is 5 3/4. I've got some loose paper that I'm going to fold over for my signature. And I have a folded in half piece of book cloth, boop, and a strip that's going to go on the inside as well. So just looking at this, this is folded in half. In part, I did that so that you would know what the center was, but I also did it so to fit into your plastic baggie. So you may or may not want to have a crease in your book cloth. What I'm going to be doing is essentially putting my Davy board on either side of that line and creating a gap that is 3.5 times the thickness of the board. 3.5 times the thickness of the board allows it to move all the way around without some thickness of this board interrupting it. Sometimes when you put something too close, you can turn it, but it stops right there. You can't turn it all the way around or all the way this way around. 3.5 times the thickness of the board will ensure that that happens. So I think we'll start with gluing the paper on, or rather the book cloth on. And you might notice this is bigger than your paper, your newsprint paper. So I'm gonna kind of spread this out a little bit and just make do with what I have. Everything will work out. I'm pretty confident. Okay, so I'm just gonna put this together here. By the way, I'm going to be using my straight PVA. With such a small application, I feel that I can act fast enough to fold everything over so that it's not going to be an issue about something drying out. However, if something does dry out, I can always boop, 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 touch it up a little bit, and that is A-okay. As I mentioned in our last discussion, a lot of book artists like to cut the PVA glue and slow its drying time down by adding a material called Methylcellulose. Methylcellulose is an archival glue that is made from organic matter, and it is nice. It is reversible, so it's water soluble, and it's a lovely glue to use if you don't need a whole lot of strength. So mixing it with PVA gives it both archivalness, which PVA already has, and slows down the drying of the PVA, and makes it, it's a little less strong, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, if you're worried about your stuff drying out on you, it's a good thing. All right, so I've put this here. I have about 1 inch at the top and bottom. I have a little less than that on the sides. I'm gonna live with that. This is my center mark. So I'm gonna measure my book board. These are only 2 pieces of book board, so I'm only measuring these 2, and then I'm going to make some presumptions about the measurements thereafter. So as I measure these 2 boards, or let's just measure 1 board. And the reason I'm doing this and telling you not just a standard size is because you can buy Davy board in all sorts of different thicknesses. So it's important to actually measure what you have. So this on its own is a little, I would say it's about a 1/16 of an inch. So that tells me that 3.5 times will be, well, certainly 1/8 of an inch plus a 1/16 plus a half. If we're gonna generalize this, that kind of math, we're looking at 1/4 of an inch, all right? So that's about 1/4 of an inch that we're going to be using here. So that's pretty easy for us to figure out. So we can just sort of look at our 1/4 of an inch, and there's a little line going in between it, so it's easy peasy. And this is confusing. This line here I just did so that I would know where it was going, but I think just so you can see it, I'm going to draw a line where my midpoint is, where I have this folded. That is not necessary for you to do. I'm only doing this for our instruction purpose. So I'm gonna center that. Let's see, what can I see really well? I'm gonna center that in the middle of 1/4 of an inch. And I'm gonna draw a line. Now, whenever you draw something, keep in mind that there's a thickness to that, all right? So in this instance, I don't think it's such a bad thing because the thing about book cloth is it will expand and contract. So when we put the glue on it, it's going to loosen up, but then it's going to tighten up as it dries. And so having a little bit of wiggle room is not a bad thing. So here's one side, here's the other. That's about 1/4 of an inch that I've measured right there. So I'm going to line this guy up here, pretty much in the middle. If I had this to do over again, I would have added a little bit more there, but frankly, this is fine, as long as you know that it's going to go over the edge and give you a little bit of space. Once it's done that, you're fine. I think when I was cutting this, it had something to do with the materials that I had available. I was trying to be frugal about the way I was cutting things. Okay, so I'm lining this up. It's important that everything is even, and I like to do this before the glue gets into the situation because we know how hairy it gets when the glue is wet and things start curling and it's not so much fun. Okay, I've got a little piece of scrap, so I'm going to use that to create my corner. And remember, we want to measure what we consider to be 1.5 times the thickness of the board so that it folds over nicely. That is like Book Arts 101. We learned that the first day. All right. This is what I have. I'm going to cut off those corners. Remember, I'm cutting just to the right of that line to approximate 1.5 times the thickness of the board. The pencil mark is also its own thickness. Just keep that in mind. If you're really interested in the precision of your pencil mark, what you might want to do is to get yourself an automatic pencil. The zebra pencil is my favorite. That allows just the lead to come through and not the actual apparatus of the pen to create its own sort of thickness. It's what a carpenter friend of mine uses. He is very, very on top of precision. All right, so here's this. Let me do this so I can hopefully discard this without too much headache. Got my PVA, and I'm going to apply my PVA as thinly as I can from the middle out and rapidly. I'm not daydreaming as I do this. So it is a lousy day today. It is raining, 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 raining. And this is what happens every year. And every year I'm shocked. And why? I don't know. Maybe I have a questionable IQ. I don't know. But every year it gets cold. And then, you know, we have all this rain and all of the beautiful fall leaves fly off the trees. And then one day you wake up and it looks like this. There is just these stark branches with no beautiful leaves. And it's cold and it's raining. And you think you're in Scotland or something. I hate it. I hate it. Here we go. I do understand those people who spend their summers and spring and fall in the Northeast and then flee to some warm spot. It's not really a luxury many college professors have, but I think it's a great idea. Okay, so I'm gonna lift this up. Oh, I'm trying not to get glue on the front. Woo, yikes. Now, incidentally, when you mark up the back of your bookbinding cloth, you wanna make sure that it's not gonna seep through to the other side. Sometimes you can buy a bookbinding cloth that's very, you know, delicate, and you don't want to see these ugly pencil marks on the other side of the board. So just keep that in mind, other side of the cloth, I should say. All right, there I am. I think things are centered where they need to be. Maybe I'll move that over a tiny bit. Okay, so I'm using my paper to do the fold over. Fold over top and bottom first. I'm pressing it down. And then, as I always do, I'm gonna smush down this little triangle corner towards the inside so that I don't get any kind of messy looking gap. Smush. And then I'm going to use again this paper to turn things over. Now, if I feel like I've got, you know, a little bit of glue somewhere it shouldn't be, and I'm worried that I'm gonna get it on my fabric, throw out that piece of paper, for goodness sakes, right? Because once you get glue on the front, the best thing that you can do after you've cried into your pillow is to wait, to let it dry, and then try to scrape it off with maybe a razor delicately. You can't get it wet. It'll just make some yucky looking stain, and then you'll be in more despair. Okay, so here we are. Turns nicely. I'm going to put the interior little strip of fabric here. And again, this is like the paper. This is 1/4 of an inch smaller than the book board. So this Davy board was 5 3/4, so this is 5 1/2. The width of this is about 3 inches. Generally 3 inches is about what I'm comfortable with. I know that there's gonna be paper that sits on top of this edge. I could make it more narrow if I'd like, you know, I could do that, but you know, I like 3 inches, so there you go. All right, I'm gonna use some of this with that. And incidentally, you can thin this down with water if you'd like. It's really a fabulous glue, actually. I was using it with some of my sculptures as an experiment to see, because I thought, oh, this is gonna peel right off, this is gonna be a super drag, but it was perfect. It hardened like a rock. Nice, just what I want. Uh-oh, curling. I'm going to be very careful. And I'm going to try to make sure this is in the middle. All right, that's laid down. I suggest that you use a piece of paper to do this, just because it's going to be cleaner. If you have some wax paper around, wax paper is great to use with book arts. You can use it for sort of flattening things down like I'm doing now. So what I've been doing is I was compressing that groove, which we could call the French groove, down as much as I possibly could. I'm going to do it on the other side too, while everything is damp and pliable. That's the thing to do. So I'm going to fold this to ensure it's folding correctly, and it looks pretty nice. Looks pretty nice. So I'm going to put that aside, and I'm going to start on the signature that I'm collecting of pages. Now, this is a very skinny book, right? And it's skinny because I anticipated it needing to be skinny for this signature. This signature is rather scant. So in your calculations for how wide this should be, you need to think about how thick your signature is. Got all these nasty little crusty spots. So if I had something that was very thick, this would have to accommodate it as well. So I would have that in my measurements. I would measure the thickness of the signature thickness and add it to the 3.5 times equation and go from there. This, I know from experience, is not very thick, and this will close nicely as is. So I'm going to use about 6 sheets of paper. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I could go up to 7 or 8, but after that it starts getting too thick and looks kind of clunky. Now, I could fold this all over at once, or I could fold these individually depending on how I want to go. I think, you know what, I feel like I want to do half and half. And so I'm carefully bringing the corners together, flattening it out with my bone folder from the middle out to the sides. There's that. Now, this is slightly misleading because it looks like I'm creating 2 signatures. My plan is simply, jogging this down so everything's even. My plan is actually to nest that inside of this or vice versa. We'll see what looks better. I guess I'll do the green on the outside. So I did a somewhat fancy way of creating these pages. Okay, so now all I need to do is figure out where all of the stations or the holes are gonna go, all right? Here is our jig, done. Here is our jig, not done. For this kind of sewing, you need an odd number of stations, all right? So what I have figured out is 9, and I started this here at 3/4 and then a 1/2 inch in between. So I'm starting at 3/4. Where's that ruler of mine? Pull everything out. I always, oh, here it is, here we go. Okay, so let's start here, 3/4. So make a little mark there, boop, boop. And then 3/4 on the other side. Boop. And then a 1/2 inch in between. 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch. Oops, it's a little crooked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Exactly what I want. All right, just for the sake of our own discussion, let's label these stations. Stations are the holes. All right, 3/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch. I'm gonna cut that little tiny pie slice, whoop, so that I have an easier time creating my hole. So see that itty bitty little notch I took out? That's what I'm doing. Just makes things a little bit easier. All all this glue stuck to my fingers, so forgive me if I look horrifying. Cut, cut. We had a lot of nice weekends leading up to this horror of rain. There's only one that was really crappy. The rest were quite glorious, so I suppose I shouldn't complain, but I will anyway, as that is my nature. Okay, so this is the jig for the pages. It's also going to be the jig we use for the actual book. This should be shorter than this because this is the height of the pages themselves. Let you look at that. Sorry about that. You would think I'd edit that out, but I'm not going to. People sneeze. Okay, so when I figured this out, I'm just basically going to place it in the middle, knowing that I'm gonna have a little bit at the top and a little bit at the bottom, and that's exactly the way things are supposed to be. All right, friends. I'm going to use my cradle and, and I'm going to make sure that I've labeled, incidentally, that's the one we made together. So I'm gonna label the head at the top and the foot at the bottom so I can keep track of this stuff, right? And I'm going to put the head up at the head of the cradle, and I'm gonna push with my all straight down. Which I know you can't see, but you've seen this before. Here, I'll show you. Yoink, straight down, boop, boop, boop. Okay, so that's that. I need to be sure that my actual holes went all the way through. Sometimes they don't. Now, I'm gonna put that aside, and I'm gonna remember this one, this part was the head. So I'm gonna put that over there. And now I'm gonna take this, I'm gonna do the same thing, but I'm not gonna make this flush here, or I'll have this weird gap at the bottom. I'm gonna place this in the middle. Oops, do it that way. Right, so I've got a little bit of space at the top and bottom, and now I'm gonna push those holes in. Yoink. I don't know if you can see that at all, but you can use your imagination there. I'll pull it out in just a second. Now, we know that if we don't have a cradle in our lives, we can still do this. It's not a big deal. You can simply hold this up, and that was the head. I had to flip it over, so H. Okay, so I could just line this up as I want it to be, and then make the holes accordingly. All right, so it's not the end of the world if you don't have a cradle. A cradle just makes life a little easier, but what do we need with an easy life, right? Okay, and they went all the way through. I've tried to get them in the middle of this. I think I was fairly successful there. That was my aim. Okay, so that's done. This is done. I'm ready to start sewing. Okie dokie. I think I'm gonna use, what thread? I think the pink might be something you can see better than this kind. I do recommend using some waxed thread for this because there's gonna be some tightening that you need to do. I also, let's see, let's look at my needle choices. I'm looking for a skinny one, yoink, that's head is, you know, the eye, I should say, is large enough to accommodate my thread. Pull these back. There's nothing worse than losing a needle, because your foot will find it. No problem. So how long should this be? You know, a good rule of thumb is simply to make it 3.5 times the height of the book, and you'll be okay. I think for this sewing, that's about the length of my arm. I think it's gonna be okay for this. With some fancier sewings, you need to really add more thread, but I think this is gonna be fine. So I'm gonna try to thread this. My dog, the puppy, will eat anything. And I know that for a fact because I see it on the other end. And I don't know how the dog has survived, but the dog eats things like needles and pins and paper clips. It's a hard time getting this in, so I'm gonna cut this again. I caught him chewing on a screw the other day. What the heck? Why would he want to chew on a screw? Why would he want to swallow a pin? I don't know. I really don't know. I'm gonna use a different needle. This doesn't seem that different at all. Maybe it just has a different vibe to it, but let's try it out instead of the other one. I know if I swallowed a pin, I'd have some troubles, for sure. Aha! It went through. Pull that out. Now we can do our little fancy schmancy thing with our stitching. So I'm gonna pull this out, enough for me to circle around and stab the tail. And by stabbing, I mean sewing into the tail so that I can pull it down like so, over the eye, boop, and then I can pull that tight, or I can just leave it as is. When things are really heavily waxed, as this thread is, sometimes it's not useful to pull it all the way to the top. As long as it doesn't have a lot of texture to it, it's gonna be fine. All right. We are gonna jog this together, and we're gonna make sure that we have the right holes aligned. And again, we're calling our holes stations. So when we look at this, the reason I have these numbered is because you can refer to, and often when you look at directions, it'll say station 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, etc. So it always counts from the head to the foot. I'm gonna start at 2, all right? So when I look at this, that is station 1, 2, and I'm gonna sew from the inside so that the tail of my thread stays on the inside. Oops. I'll leave a little bit there, okay? I have a tiny little bowl clip. Where are you, bowl clip? Tiny bowl clip? Here I am. So I'm gonna just clip this into place because I'm sick of this moving around so much. Boink. All right, I'm gonna do a running stitch all the way down here. And remember, a running stitch is sometimes called a link stitch, which means just going in and out, in and out, in and out. Just like you would sew, if you were sewing by hand, a pair of trousers or something at the hem. In and out, in and out. Actually, it's not how I would do a hem, but you get the picture. And I'm finding my needle is a little larger than the actual stations I've created, so I'm gonna open them up a little bit. Make things easier for sewing. In and out, in and out, in and out. All right. Dun, dun, dun. Oh! Oh my God, I'm so stupid. I should have done this on here. Oh dear. What did I say about low IQ? I can't even remember what that was in context with. All right, so I'm undoing all my sewing because I'm a lunatic. But just goes to show, it can happen to anyone. Because I'm sewing on this. I'm so used to just sewing the signature. Good thing this is recorded, right? Okay, I'm all the way out here. Okay, now I'm going to sew onto the cover. Dum, dum, dum. Okay. Pull this out. Okay, see? And I'm going to do that running stitch back and forth, using this. Now this is kind of cumbersome. Don't worry, it's gonna be all right in the end. Everything's gonna be all right. It's getting caught on my little bull clip. So I'm gonna take it off. Oh, whoa. So I'm just taking care that I'm creating the stations or maintaining the stations that I actually poked, and not creating brand new ones. There's a cart that keeps going back and forth. Can you hear it? I don't know what they're carrying. They put outside of my studio, so I was telling you about, you know, how they had Oktoberfest. Now they have filled in this whole space, which is quite fascinating, actually. Made a nice skating rink. They did this last year, and I was really impressed with it, and I continue to be impressed. Basically, they just made like this shallow pool, and they've got these freezing coils underneath it. And I don't know how many inches it is, probably at least 4 inches maybe. And they have this ice skating rink. It's cool, man. I'm all for ice skating rinks. Okay, so here I am. I'm gonna go back, but I'm gonna get a little tricky as I do this. Uh-oh, did I just make a new hole? Not what I wanted to do. I'm gonna try to fix it. Okay, so now I'm on the outside. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be creating that pearl or bead, however you want to refer to it. And I'm going to do that by wrapping my thread around that spot. And I'm going to do it as many times as I want to. Meaning, the bulk of the pearl or bead, whatever we want to call it, is going to be created by how many times you wrap this around. And on the last wrap around, so that this doesn't come apart, I'm going to create a knot, all right? And I'm going to really be careful that I'm doing it on top of that bead. You'll get to see me do this again. So there it is. I'm going to sew down to the next station, come straight through, and then come out the other end to the front, with spine, and I'm gonna do the same thing. So it's empty spot, bead, empty spot, bead. So show you again, empty spot, bead, empty spot, bead. So now I need to establish the bead. And last time I went around this 3 times, and then I did my knot. So let's see how that looks. Oof. I want to stay consistent. So in other words, I don't want to have one that's like 7, and then the other one's, you know, 2, something ridiculous, so that these are all out of step. However, you know, you are an artist. You might be saying to yourself, well, why don't I want to do that? And you know what? I don't know. Maybe you should do that. If it's important for it to have its own sort of rhythm, that could be actually quite interesting. Okay, so I did 3 times, and then this is the 4th time, and I'm making my knot by creating that little loop and having my needle go through, and there it is. All right, so I'm going to continue on. Okay, see what I'm doing. And now I'm going to need my bead again, because empty bead, empty bead, empty bead. I'm going to end up with 4 beads for this. And this is a lot easier. I don't know why I wasn't doing this earlier. 2, 3, and I want it to sort of, I don't want it to spread out. I want it to be on top of itself. meaning I want it to create some bulk. I do not want to sew into my fabric of the book cloth. All right, so there's that, looking good. Sewing in, sewing here. Okay, empty bead, empty bead, empty bead, empty bead. I need to have my bead. There's something quite satisfying about these little books. I can't really quite explain it. I like them a lot, even though they're very small and short. So I believe that was 3 times. Now I'm gonna make my knot. And I'm so careful. All right, now I'm gonna go in. This is station 1. So I started at station 2, so I'm gonna go into station 1. And I'm gonna do my tie off on the inside of this book. So there we are. You should have your original little tail. And incidentally, if this is getting very loose along the way, you can't wait till later. You have to tighten it up a little bit, little bit, little bit each time you do your sewing, because you don't want it to be all loosey-goosey. We can't use glue or anything like that to tighten it up. So your sewing is important. Now you could do a couple things here. You could just tie it. I always like to sew under the last stitch just to make it a little bit more secure, and then I'll do my knot. Boink. And I'm doing 2. If it's too bulky, you might just want to do 1, although that's a little bit dangerous because it might come loose. All right, so this is what it looks like on the inside, and this is what it looks like on the outside. Now it's still not done. And it's not done because you've got this ugly stuff here. Okay, so we are gonna just cover that up. I have this pre-cut, so I'm gonna be putting that right there. Ooh, so easy to see, right? And remember, I measured this, subtracted 1/4 inch. I'm gonna use this. If I had something stiffer, I might use my PVA, but I'm always a little bit nervous about the PVA with just straight old paper, especially cheap paper like this, because it does like to curl. And curling is just disastrous, or just a pain in the neck. It's actually not the curling that I'm not worried about. It's the wrinkling. When something gets damp, there's all this kind of wrinkling as it expands. So I placed this as much in the middle as I possibly could. I didn't just slap it down and go, okay, it's all right, just like that. Because I care about the craftsmanship of things. Granted, it's the first time you're making this, but in general, you need to care about these things. So that looks good. I'm gonna do the other side. And you could argue that in order to stick well onto that fabric, you might want to use the PVA. I'm gonna leave it up to you. If you made that argument to me, I might find myself agreeing with you a bit. We'll see how this sticks. I think it's gonna stick fine. Appropriately spaced. All right, now really push that down. I'm gonna put another piece of paper on top. Remember, if you have wax paper, that's even more wonderful to use. All right, that's pretty well stuck. You know, you can see this really easily, and that's one of the reasons I chose it. But like this book has paper that is a little bit more in step with the cover. That might be something that you want to do. all right? In this case, the only real reason we have end paper is simply to cover the exposed Davy board. It doesn't do anything in terms of strength, doesn't hold our book block in, nothing like that. Our book block is held in by the sewing that goes through the actual cover. And we're done, hooray, hooray. So you should have done by now the hardback journal. So let me find that. You've done this. Here it is. I think this is the example I showed, right? So here it is. La la, da, 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 da. So this was the first part of this. And now this is the conclusion of our sewing. But of course, if you want to look at your handout and do some other things, some variations, go for it. But we are now finished with all of our demonstration workshops. So spring into action and work on your final project, which I look forward to seeing at the very end of the semester. Thanks.